He was 5 seconds away from losing $4 billion. Julian Sterling, the Wolf of Wall Street's new era, held a Mont Blanc pen worth more than most cars. Across from him sat a man selling the deal of the century. It was supposed to be the merger that defined a generation. But standing in the shadows, holding a tray of vintage Cabernet, was a woman nobody noticed. She wasn't a corporate spy. She wasn't an FBI agent. She was just a waitress on the night shift. And with one terrified sentence, she didn't just save his company, she saved his life. This is the story of the signing that never happened. The private dining room at Le Bernardin in Midtown Manhattan didn't smell like food. It smelled like power. It was a scent composed of conditioned air, heavy starch on Egyptian cotton tablecloths, and the distinct metallic tang of fear that Julian Sterling was trying desperately to ignore. Julian, the CEO of Sterling Heavy Industries, adjusted the cuff of his charcoal Brioni suit. He was 38 years old, young for a man controlling a logistics empire that spanned 3 continents, but tonight he looked 50. His blue eyes, usually sharp enough to cut glass, were rimmed with red. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. Across the mahogany table sat Richard Calloway. If Julian was a wolf, Calloway was a viper, sleek, cold, and moving with a terrifying lack of wasted energy. Calloway was the head of Ethelgard Holdings, a private equity firm that had emerged from the shadows of the European markets to offer Julian a lifeline. "You're hesitating, Julian," Calloway said. His voice was smooth, like expensive scotch poured over gravel. He tapped a manicured finger on the leather-bound document between them. "The board is waiting. The Tokyo markets open in 3 hours. This merger puts Sterling Industries back on top. It erases the debt. It erases the scandal your father left behind." Julian flinched at the mention of his father. The late William Sterling had built the company, but had nearly destroyed it with gambling debts and off-book loans before his sudden death last year. Julian had spent every waking moment since the funeral trying to patch the holes in the sinking ship. "I'm not hesitating, Richard," Julian lied, reaching for his water glass. His hand trembled, just a fraction of a millimeter, but Calloway saw it. A shark always sees blood in the water. "I'm just reviewing the final indemnity clause." "It's standard boilerplate," Calloway dismissed, leaning back. "My legal team at Skadden Arps drafted it personally. You have the capital injection of $4.5 billion upon signature. In exchange, Ethelgard takes a 49% stake and 2 seats on the board. It's a miracle, Julian. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth." In the corner of the room, invisible to the titans of industry, Sarah Miller adjusted her grip on the silver serving tray. Sarah was 29, though the shadows under her eyes made her look older. She wore the standard uniform, black slacks, crisp white shirt, black vest, but she wore it like armor. She had been working at Le Bernardin for 6 months, a ghost drifting between tables, pouring wine for men who wouldn't deign to look her in the eye. That was how she liked it. Invisibility was safe. Invisibility kept her alive. Tonight, however, her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had been in the room for the last hour, topping off water glasses and decanting a 1982 Chateau Margaux, blending into the wallpaper. But she had been listening. More importantly, she had seen the papers. When Calloway had gone to the restroom earlier, leaving the dossier open, Sarah had moved to clear a bread plate. Her eyes had darted to the exposed page. It wasn't just a jumble of legalese to her. Most waitresses would see text. Sarah saw patterns. Before she was Sarah Miller, waitress and nobody, she had been Sarah Jenkins, a senior forensic auditor for Deloitte in Chicago. She had been the best at finding money that didn't want to be found, that life ended 2 years ago in a fire that took her house, her reputation, and nearly her sanity, forcing her to flee to New York and change her name. She knew the font. She knew the structure. And as she looked at the document sitting in front of Julian Sterling, she felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the smell of truffles. "More wine, Mr. Calloway?" Sarah asked. Her voice was steady, a practiced, professional monotone. "Please," Calloway said, not looking at her. He was staring at Julian, his eyes predatory. "Well, Julian, the pen is right there." Julian picked up the Mont Blanc. It felt heavy, like lead. He looked at the signature line, Julian A. Sterling, CEO. If he signed this, the debt collectors would back off. The unions would get their pensions guaranteed. He would be the savior of the family legacy. But why did it feel like he was putting a gun to his head? "I just need a moment," Julian whispered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "We don't have a moment," Calloway snapped, his mask slipping for the first time. The aggression in his voice was sudden and sharp. "The wire transfer window closes at 6 p.m. That is in 4 minutes. Sign the damn papers, Julian, or Ethelgard walks, and Sterling Industries is bankrupt by morning." The threat hung in the air. Julian unscrewed the cap of the pen. The scratching sound was deafening in the silence. Sarah moved forward to pour the wine into Calloway's glass. She watched the dark red liquid swirl. She looked at Julian. He looked defeated. He looked like a good man backed into a corner by a monster. She remembered the fire in Chicago. She remembered the man who had threatened her, a man who worked for a shell company that looked suspiciously like the one listed as the guarantor on page 14 of Calloway's contract. "Don't do it," a voice screamed in her head. "Stay invisible. If you speak, you die. If you speak, they find you." Julian lowered the pen to the paper. The tip touched the fiber. Ink began to bleed into the page. Sarah's hand shook. A drop of wine splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, a blood-red stain expanding rapidly near Calloway's cuff. "You clumsy bitch!" Calloway roared, jumping back, his face twisting into a mask of ugly rage. "That's a $5,000 suit!" Julian looked up, startled, the spell broken for a split second. He looked at Sarah. For the first time, he actually saw her. He saw the terror in her green eyes. He saw that she wasn't looking at the spilled wine. She was looking at the document. "I'm so sorry, sir," Sarah stammered, grabbing a napkin. She leaned in to dab the wine, placing her body between Calloway and Julian. "Get away from me," Calloway snarled, shoving her hand away. "Julian, sign the paper. Now. Ignore the help." Sarah froze. She was inches from Julian's ear. She could smell his cologne, sandalwood and exhaustion. This was it. The precipice. She tightened her grip on the napkin. She didn't look at Calloway. She looked directly into Julian Sterling's eyes, transmitting every ounce of urgency she possessed. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning, but clear enough to stop his heart. "What?" Julian asked, bewildered. Sarah took a breath that felt like inhaling broken glass. "Check the date on the environmental audit in Appendix B," she said, her words rapid and precise. It was signed by Arthur Pence, a man who died 3 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the heavy oak doors, colder than the ice in the silver bucket. Julian Sterling didn't move. The pen remained hovering over the paper, the ink creating a small, dark blot where he had paused. His brain was processing the information, cross-referencing it with the chaotic jumble of due diligence reports he had skimmed over the last week. Arthur Pence. The name was familiar. He was the premier environmental auditor for industrial mergers. "What did you say?" Julian asked. His voice wasn't angry. It was hollow. "Get her out of here," Calloway shouted, standing up. His face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. "She's drunk. Manager! Where is the manager?" "Sit down, Richard," Julian said. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of a man who was used to commanding armies of employees. "Julian, this is ridiculous. She's a waitress. She spilled wine on me, and now she's babbling." I said, "Sit down." Julian slammed the Mont Blanc onto the table. The crack echoed like a gunshot. He turned his gaze to Sarah. She was trembling visibly now, clutching the dirty napkin to her chest, as if it could protect her from the fallout of what she had just done. "Repeat that," Julian said to her. "Slowly." Sarah swallowed hard. She knew Calloway was staring at her, burning a hole into the side of her head. She knew that by tomorrow she might have to run again. But she had started this. She had to finish it. "The environmental impact report," Sarah said, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. "Appendix B. It validates the assets of the subsidiary you're acquiring. It's signed by Arthur Pence. I remember reading his obituary in the Financial Times. He died in a skiing accident in Gstaad in 2021. If he signed that report dated 2 weeks ago, the report is a forgery. And if the report is a forgery, the assets don't exist." Julian stared at her. "How do you know who Arthur Pence is?" "I read," she said simply. It was a half-truth, but it was all she could offer right now. Julian flipped the heavy document open. He tore through the pages, ignoring the delicate binding, until he reached the back. Appendix B. He scanned the bottom of the page. Signed, Arthur J. Pence. Dated, October 14th, 2025. Julian looked up. He looked at Richard Calloway. The transformation in Calloway was terrifying. The suave, sophisticated investor was gone. In his place was a man with eyes like a trapped rat, calculating, desperate, and dangerous. "It's a clerical error," Calloway said, but his voice cracked. "They must have used an old template. Julian, be reasonable. We're talking about $4 billion. Are you going to throw that away because a waitress reads the obituaries?" "A clerical error?" Julian asked, his voice rising. "You told me this audit was conducted last week. You told me Pence personally walked the site in Nevada." "He did. I mean, his team did. It's just a name on a page, Julian." "It's fraud, Richard," Julian said. He closed the folder. "It's fraud." Julian stood up. He was tall, 6'2", and for the first time in months, he stood at his full height. The fatigue seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold, hard rage. "The deal is off." "You can't do that," Calloway hissed. He moved around the table, encroaching on Julian's space. "You signed the letter of intent. If you walk away now, I'll sue you for breach of contract. I'll bury you in litigation, so deep you'll need a submarine to find sunlight. Sterling Industries will be liquidated for scrap. Sue me," Julian challenged, "and I'll subpoena Arthur Pence's corpse to testify." Calloway's jaw tightened. He looked at the document, then at Julian, and finally he turned his malevolent gaze onto Sarah. "You," Calloway whispered. He didn't scream. The whisper was worse. "You have no idea what you've just stepped into. You stupid little girl. You think you're a hero. You're a loose end." "Get out," Julian said, stepping in front of Sarah, "before I call security and have you thrown out." Calloway straightened his jacket. He regained a sliver of his composure, slicking back his hair. He grabbed his briefcase. "This isn't over, Sterling, not by a long shot. And you—" He pointed a finger at Sarah. "Watch your back." Calloway stormed out of the private room, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him with a thud that vibrated through the floor. The silence returned, but now it was charged with adrenaline. Julian exhaled a long breath, his hands gripping the back of his chair. He looked at the document on the table. the paper that had almost been his death warrant. Then he turned to Sarah. She was backing away toward the service door, her eyes wide. "Wait," Julian said. "I have to go," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I have tables. My manager." "Forget the manager. Forget the tables." Julian walked around the table and approached her. He didn't crowd her. He stopped a respectful 3 feet away. "Who are you?" "I'm just a waitress. Sarah Miller." Sarah Miller doesn't know who Arthur Pence is. Sarah Miller doesn't spot a forged signature in a legal appendix from across a dinner table. Julian narrowed his eyes, studying her face. "You saved me. Why?" "I didn't do it for you," Sarah said, her defensiveness flaring up. "I did it because men like him shouldn't win." She turned to leave again, but Julian reached out, catching her gently by the elbow. "He threatened you," Julian said. "Calloway. He's not a man who makes empty threats. If that report is fake, this is a massive criminal conspiracy. They're laundering money, or they're hiding toxic debt. You just popped a $4 billion bubble." "I know," Sarah whispered. "That's why I have to leave. Now." "You can't go home," Julian said. "If he knows you work here, he can find out where you live in an hour. He has resources you can't imagine." "I know exactly what resources he has," Sarah snapped. The outburst surprised both of them. She covered her mouth, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting microphones in the sconces. Julian stared at her. The puzzle pieces were clicking together. The intelligence in her eyes, the fear, the specific knowledge of corporate fraud. "You're not Sarah Miller," Julian stated. It wasn't a question. She pulled her arm away from his grip. "I can't talk to you. I've already said too much." "If you walk out that door," Julian said, his voice grave, "you're on your own. Calloway will have someone waiting by the employee exit in 10 minutes. I know these people. I know how they operate." Sarah froze. She knew he was right. She had run from Chicago to escape this exact scenario, and she had walked right back into it because she couldn't keep her mouth shut. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to know the truth," Julian said. "And I want to offer you a ride. My car is downstairs. Armor-plated, security detail. It's the safest place in New York right now." Sarah hesitated. Every instinct she had, honed over the last 2 years, screamed run. But she looked at the service door, then back at the billionaire. She thought of the cold, dead eyes of Richard Calloway. "My name," she said softly, "is Sarah Jenkins. And until 2 years ago, I was a senior forensic auditor for Deloitte." Julian nodded slowly. "Well, Ms. Jenkins, it seems we have a lot to discuss. Grab your coat." The ride from Le Bernardin to Julian's penthouse at 432 Park Avenue was a study in suffocating tension. Julian's car was a Mercedes Maybach S680, a tank disguised as a luxury sedan. The windows were tinted dark enough to hide the world, but Sarah stared out of them anyway, watching the blur of midtown lights, expecting a black SUV to ram them at every intersection. Julian was on the phone the entire time, speaking in codes. "Freeze the accounts. Level 5 encryption on the servers. No, don't tell the board. Get Simon Drake on the line. I don't care if he's in bed. Wake him up." Sarah sank into the beige leather seats. She felt the adrenaline crashing, replaced by the cold reality of what she had done. She had just exposed herself to the kind of people who made witnesses disappear. When they arrived at the tower, private security escorted them up a dedicated elevator. The penthouse was a sprawling glass box, floating 200 feet above the city. It was beautiful, sterile, and cold. "Drink," Julian said, handing her a glass of scotch as she stood by the window. looking at the grid of Manhattan. "I don't drink on the job," she said automatically, then laughed, a brittle, cracking sound. "I guess I don't have a job anymore." "I'll buy the restaurant and hire you back if you want," Julian said, unbuttoning his collar. He looked exhausted. "But right now, I need you to explain exactly how you know Calloway is running a fraud." Sarah took the scotch. She needed it. "It's not just Calloway, it's a network. 2 years ago, I was auditing a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Chicago called Redstone Logistics. They were being acquired by a shell company called Obsidian Partners. The deal looked perfect on paper. Too perfect." She took a sip, the burn grounding her. "I found discrepancies in their environmental liabilities. They were hiding toxic waste dumping sites to inflate the asset value. When I flagged it to my partner, he told me to drop it. The next day, my car brakes failed on I-90. I survived. Barely. 2 days later, my house burned down with my cat inside." Julian's face hardened. "Obsidian Partners?" "A subsidiary of Ethelgard Holdings," Sarah said. "I tracked the money before I ran. Calloway isn't an investor, Julian. He's a butcher. He buys distressed companies, creates fake audits to inflate their value, uses those inflated assets to secure massive loans from banks. And then he guts the company," Julian finished, realization dawning on him. "He transfers the loans to the company, takes the cash for himself, and lets the business file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The creditors get pennies, and he walks away with billions." "Exactly," Sarah said. "He was going to load Sterling Industries with $4 billion of toxic debt from that shell company he was selling you. You would have been bankrupt in 6 months, and because you signed the indemnity clause, I would have been personally liable," Julian whispered. "He wasn't just trying to kill my company. He was trying to destroy my life." The elevator dinged. Sarah jumped, spilling a drop of scotch. A man walked in. He was older, balding, wearing a rumpled trench coat over pajamas. This was Simon Drake, Julian's general counsel and godfather. "Julian, you mind explaining why I had to leave my wife in bed to come here? And why the hell did you blow up the Ethelgard deal? The stock is going to tank in pre-market trading." "Simon, shut up and listen," Julian said. "This is Sarah. She just saved us from a $4 billion death sentence." Simon looked at Sarah, adjusting his glasses. "The waitress? Julian, have you lost your mind?" "She's a forensic auditor, Simon, and she found Pence." Simon went still. "Pence? Arthur Pence?" "Dead 3 years," Julian said. "Yet he signed the due diligence report on the Nevada assets." Simon dropped his briefcase on the floor. He walked over to the wet bar and poured himself a drink without asking. "If that's true," Simon said, his voice trembling, "then we are in a war. Calloway has leverage on half the board. If we don't prove this fraud by the shareholder meeting on Friday—" "Friday?" Sarah asked. "That's in 3 days." "No," Julian corrected, looking at his Patek Philippe watch. "That's in 48 hours. Calloway will move up the timeline. He knows we know." As if on cue, Julian's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. "It's the board," Julian said grimly. "They've called an emergency vote of no confidence for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. They're going to fire me for mental instability and force the deal through without me." Sarah looked at the 2 men. They were powerful, rich, and completely out of their depth regarding the mechanics of the fraud. "We don't need 48 hours, Sarah said, setting her glass down. Her eyes had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by the cold, analytical focus of the auditor who had once brought down a Chicago syndicate. "We need access to the data room. Tonight." The headquarters of Sterling Industries was a monolith of steel and glass in the financial district. At 2 a.m., It was a ghost town, save for the cleaning crews and the security guards who nodded deferentially to Julian as he strode through the lobby. Sarah walked beside him, wearing one of Julian's spare blazers over her waitress uniform. It smelled of him, which was distracting, but she pushed the thought away. "We can't access Ethelgard's servers," Simon said, struggling to keep up with them as they headed for the executive elevator. "That's hacking. It's illegal. I can't be a party to this." "We aren't hacking them," Sarah said. "We're hacking you." "Excuse me?" Julian asked, arching a brow. "Calloway's team sent over a virtual data room, VDR, for the merger due diligence," Sarah explained, as the elevator rocketed to the 50th floor. "Usually those files are read-only, but if they forged the PDFs, they might have been sloppy with the metadata. Criminals are arrogant. They think no one looks at the binary code of a PDF." They entered Julian's office. It was corner-facing, overlooking the harbor. Sarah didn't admire the view. She went straight to Julian's terminal. "Log in," she commanded. Julian typed his password. Sarah took the chair, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't a hacker, but she knew how to strip a document down to its bones. She pulled up the Appendix B file. She opened the command terminal. "What is she doing?" Simon whispered to Julian. "She's hunting," Julian said softly, watching her with an intensity that surprised him. He had dated supermodels and heiresses, women who commanded rooms with their beauty. But watching Sarah dismantle a billion-dollar lie with nothing but her brain? That was the most attractive thing he had ever seen. "Got you," Sarah muttered. "What?" Julian leaned over her shoulder. "See this?" She pointed to a string of code in the file properties. "The author of the document, it's not Arthur Pence. The original file creator is listed as J. Moretti." "Joey Moretti?" Simon gasped. "He's Ethelgard's CFO. And look at the creation date," Sarah continued. "This PDF wasn't scanned from an old document. It was created 4 days ago, in Adobe Acrobat Pro. They didn't even bother to scrub the editing history." "That proves the document is fake," Julian said. "But it's not enough to send to the FBI. They'll claim it's a draft, a mistake. We need the original financials. We need to show they don't have the assets." Sarah sat back, biting her lip. "The metadata shows where the file was pulled from. It references a server path. Ethelgard, *server for projects. Project Icarus. Project Icarus," Julian mused. "Fitting. They plan to fly too close to the sun." "We need to get into server 4, Sarah said. "But that's on their internal network. I can't touch that from here." "I know someone who can," Julian said. He pulled out a burner phone from his desk drawer. "I have a guy, former NSA. He does competitive intelligence." "Julian, no," Simon warned. "If you bring in a mercenary, you cross a line." "They tried to kill her, Simon." Julian's voice cracked like a whip. He pointed at Sarah. "They burned her house down. They are trying to steal my company. The line was crossed a long time ago." Julian made the call. 20 minutes later, a link appeared in his secure email. "He's in," Julian said. "He's mirroring their drive." They watched the progress bar load. 10%, 40%, 80%. Suddenly, the screen flashed red. "Access denied. Security breach detected." "They traced us," Sarah said. Panic rising. "Disconnect, now!" Julian yanked the Ethernet cable from the wall, but the screen went black. A single line of green text appeared. "Hello, Julian. We see you." The office phone rang. The sound was shrill and terrifying in the quiet room. Julian stared at it. He put it on speaker. "Mr. Sterling." Richard Calloway's voice filled the room. He sounded amused. "Did you really think your little waitress could outsmart my IT department?" "It's over, Richard," Julian said, his voice steady. "We know about the forgery." Proof is a slippery thing. Calloway laughed. And speaking of slippery things, you might want to check the news. Julian grabbed his tablet. He opened the Wall Street Journal app. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Whistleblower alleges CEO Julian Sterling embezzling millions, board to vote on removal." "I control the narrative, Julian," Calloway said. "By the time the sun comes up, you'll be a pariah. And that girl? The police are on their way to your office right now. An anonymous tip says she's an industrial spy trying to sabotage the merger. You're harboring a fugitive." The line went dead. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder. "We have to run," Sarah said, standing up. "Julian, they're coming." "Simon," Julian turned to his lawyer. "Stall them, show them the metadata, buy us time." "Where are you going?" Simon asked, pale as a sheet. Julian grabbed Sarah's hand. "To find the one thing Calloway can't delete." They took the service elevator down to the sub-basement parking garage. Julian didn't take the Maybach. He led Sarah to a dusty, nondescript Ford sedan parked in the corner. "My escape car," he explained as he revved the engine. "Registered to a shell company nobody knows about." They sped out into the New York night just as NYPD cruisers swarmed the front entrance of the Sterling Tower. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, checking the side mirror. "New Jersey," Julian said. "Teterboro Airport. You have a jet?" "No. Calloway has a hangar there. But he also has a storage facility nearby. When I was looking at the due diligence, I saw an invoice for a storage unit in Newark under the name Apex Logistics." "The company from Chicago," Sarah breathed. "He keeps the paper records. He has to. He's paranoid." "Exactly. Digital can be deleted. Paper is forever." The drive was a blur. They arrived at a desolate industrial park in Newark at 4 a.m. The facility, Iron Mountain Storage, was a fortress of corrugated metal and barbed wire. "How do we get in?" Sarah asked. "Guard dogs? Cameras?" "Money," Julian said. He pulled up to the guard shack. An older man was dozing inside. Julian rolled down the window. He held up a stack of $100 bills. "I lost my keycard. Unit 404. Apex Logistics. I really need to grab some tax documents before the IRS opens." The guard looked at the cash, then at Julian's expensive suit, now rumpled, and shrugged. Greed was a universal language. He buzzed the gate open. They drove to Unit 404. Julian used a crowbar from the trunk to pop the padlock. It snapped with a sharp clack. They rolled up the metal door. The smell of old paper and dust hit them. Inside were hundreds of boxes, stacked floor to ceiling. "My God," Sarah whispered. "It's a graveyard." "Start looking," Julian said. "We need anything related to Sterling Industries or the environmental reports." They tore through the boxes. It was a needle in a haystack. Minutes turned into an hour. The sky outside began to lighten with the grey promise of dawn. "Julian!" Sarah cried out. He rushed over. She was holding a red file folder. "Look," she said, her hands shaking. "It's the original environmental assessment for the Nevada site, the one signed by the actual auditor." Julian opened it. Significant groundwater contamination. Remediation cost, $2.5 billion, asset value, negative. And this, Sarah pulled out another paper. Emails, printed emails between Calloway and his CFO, discussing how to edit the PDF to remove the liability. "This is it," Julian said, a grin breaking across his face. "This is the smoking gun. We have him." Suddenly the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside froze them. Julian killed the flashlight. "They found us." Heavy footsteps approached the open garage door. Shadows stretched long across the concrete floor. "Mr. Sterling!" a voice boomed. It wasn't the police. It was the distinct, gravelly voice of a hired cleaner. "We know you're in there. come out and we make it quick. Make us come in, and we burn the whole unit down with you inside." Julian looked at Sarah. He saw the terror returning to her eyes. He grabbed her shoulders. "Do you trust me?" he asked. "I don't know," she stammered. "There's a fire escape hatch in the back ceiling," Julian whispered. "I saw it on the building schematics when we drove in. I'm going to distract them. You take the file and climb out." "No." Sarah grabbed his lapel. "I'm not leaving you. If they catch you, they'll kill you and stage it as a suicide. Disgraced CEO takes own life. If we both stay, we both die, and Calloway wins," Julian said, intense urgency in his eyes. "You are the only one who understands the evidence, Sarah. You have to get this to the SEC." "I can't!" Julian kissed her. It was brief, desperate, and tasted of scotch and fear. "Go." He pushed her toward the back of the unit. Sarah scrambled up the shelving, clutching the red folder to her chest. She pushed open the roof hatch. She looked down one last time. Julian walked toward the open garage door, his hands raised, stepping into the headlights of the black SUVs. "Gentlemen," Julian said loudly, "let's talk." Sarah scrambled onto the roof, tears streaming down her face, and started running. The metal roof of the storage unit was slick with morning dew. Sarah scrambled across the corrugated steel, her breath tearing at her throat like jagged glass. Below her, inside Unit 404, she heard the heavy, muffled thuds of a struggle, followed by a sickening silence that was worse than any scream. Julian. She wanted to go back. Every instinct in her heart screamed at her to turn around, to drop through the hatch and fight with him. But the weight of the red folder pressed against her chest like a shield. "You are the only one who understands the evidence," he had said. If she went back, they would both die, and Calloway would win. The truth would be buried in an incinerator in New Jersey. Sarah slid down a drainage pipe on the back side of the building, tearing her palms on the rusted metal. She hit the gravel hard, rolling to absorb the impact. She didn't check for broken bones. She just ran. She ran through the desolate industrial park, a ghost in the grey pre-dawn light. Her Waitress shoes were ruined, mud splashing up her legs, her lungs burning with the sulphur smell of the marshlands. Every set of headlights that swept across the distant highway made her dive behind dumpsters, convinced it was Calloway's hit squad coming to finish the job. It took her 20 minutes to find civilization. A 24-hour gas station sat like a neon beacon in the gloom. Sarah burst through the glass doors, the bell chiming cheerfully, a jarring sound against her panic. The attendant, a teenager with headphones around his neck, looked up from his phone, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance. She was covered in dust, her hair wild, blood from her scraped hands smearing the precious red folder. "I need a phone," Sarah gasped, leaning over the counter. "Now." "Store phone is for business only, lady," the kid muttered, eyeing her warily. "You in trouble? You want me to call the cops?" "Not the cops," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "The FBI." She grabbed the landline before he could protest. Her fingers shook so hard she misdialed the first time. She forced herself to breathe, think. Chicago. Agent Miller. The number was etched into her memory, the lifeline she had been too afraid to use for 2 years. It rang 3 times. "Miller." The voice was gruff, tired. "It's Sarah Jenkins," she sobbed, the dam finally breaking. "I'm in Newark. They have Julian Sterling, and I have the proof." 8:55 a.m. The boardroom of Sterling Heavy Industries. Reviewing the timeline of corporate executions, this one was scheduled to be particularly brutal. The boardroom on the 60th floor was a sanctuary of silence and light. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Hudson River, indifferent to the crimes being committed within. 20 board members sat around the long, polished mahogany table. The air smelled of fresh coffee and expensive cologne, masking the scent of betrayal. At the head of the table, in the chair that had belonged to William Sterling and then his son, sat Richard Calloway. He looked impeccable in a pinstripe suit, his face a mask of solemn concern. "I cannot express how difficult this is for me," Calloway said, his voice smooth and practiced. He rested his hands on the table, palms down. "Julian is like a brother to me. But we have to face the reality. The stress of the merger, it broke him. The embezzlement reports we received this morning are irrefutable." "We haven't seen the reports, Richard," Simon Drake interjected. Julian's godfather looked aged, his skin grey. He sat at the far end of the table, isolated. "We only have your word and a leak to the Wall Street Journal." "The police are hunting for him as we speak, Simon," Calloway replied, his tone hardening slightly. "He fled the building last night with a waitress. A fugitive doesn't run unless he's guilty. We have a fiduciary duty to this company. The Ethelgard merger must go through by noon, or the financing collapses and Sterling Industries goes into receivership." He looked at the clock. 8:58 a.m. "I call for a vote," Calloway announced. "Motion to remove Julian Sterling as CEO effective immediately for cause, and to ratify the acquisition by Ethelgard Holdings." "Seconded," said a board member Calloway had bribed weeks ago. "All in favour?" Hands began to rise, slowly at first, then faster as the herd mentality took over. 1, 5, 12. It was a slaughter. Simon Drake refused to raise his hand, but he closed his eyes, defeated. It was over. Bam! The double doors at the entrance of the boardroom didn't just open. They were thrown open with enough force to crack the plaster. Every head turned. Richard Calloway stood up, fury flashing in his eyes. "Security. I said no interruptions." "Sit down, Richard." It wasn't a request. Sarah Jenkins marched into the room. She looked like she had crawled out of a grave. Her emerald waitressing apron was gone. Her white shirt was stained with grease and dirt, and her face was streaked with grime. But she walked with a terrifying kinetic energy that sucked the air out of the room. Flanking her were 4 agents in blue FBI windbreakers, hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Who is this?" a board member gasped. "That," Calloway sneered, pointing a shaking finger, "is the accomplice, the waitress. Officer, arrest her. She's helping Sterling steal from this company." Sarah didn't even look at the security guards. She walked straight to the center of the room, opposite Calloway. She slammed the red folder onto the mahogany table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Nobody is stealing anything," Sarah announced, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "Except him." She pointed a dirty finger at Calloway. "This woman is hysterical." Calloway laughed nervously, looking at the board. "She's clearly unstable." "Agent Miller," Sarah said, not breaking eye contact with Calloway. "Read the header." The lead FBI agent stepped forward. He opened the folder. "Environmental Audit, Site 4, Nevada. Prepared by Arthur J. Pence. Date, October 12th, 2021. The room went deadly silent. 2021? Simon Drake stood up, his eyes widening. "But the report we saw was dated last week." "Because it was forged," Sarah said. Calloway's team photoshopped the date and the signature. The real report, the one in this folder, shows the land is a toxic waste dump. The assets are worth 0. The liability is $2 billion. "She's lying!" Calloway roared, slamming his fist on the table. "She forged it. She's trying to sabotage the deal." "We also have the emails, Richard," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Printed from your secret storage unit in Newark, the one you tried to burn down this morning." Calloway's face drained of color. He looked at the door, calculating the distance. "You have nothing," Calloway hissed, desperate now. "You have stolen papers and the word of a nobody waitress against a private equity titan. Where is Julian?" If he's innocent, why isn't he here?" "He's not here," Calloway continued, regaining a sliver of confidence, "because he's a coward. Or maybe he just couldn't handle the pressure." "He's not here," a voice spoke from the hallway, low and pained, "because your men aren't very good at their jobs." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian Sterling stepped into the room. A collective gasp went through the board members. Julian was leaning heavily on a cane one of the officers had provided. His lip was split, a dark bruise was blooming across his left cheekbone, and he favored his right leg. He looked beaten, battered, and utterly unbroken. He limped into the room, the tap-tap-tap of the cane the only sound. He stopped at the head of the table. He looked at Calloway, who had slumped back into the chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. "Julian," Calloway stammered. "I was just trying to save the company. I thought you were sick." "Save it?" Julian asked. He reached into his jacket pocket. His hand was wrapped in a bandage. He pulled out a small, silver digital voice recorder. "When your cleaners cornered me in the storage unit," Julian addressed the room, "they thought they had plenty of time. They were arrogant. They bragged. They told me exactly how much you paid them to stage my suicide." He pressed play. "Boss wants it to look like an overdose. Calloway said no blood on the suit. It ruins the resale value." The grainy voice filled the pristine boardroom. Calloway looked like he was going to vomit. "But here's the twist, Richard," Julian said, turning off the recorder. "They didn't count on the FBI arriving 2 minutes after they did. Thanks to Sarah." Julian turned to Sarah. His eyes were soft, filled with an emotion that went far beyond gratitude. He looked at her dirt-streaked face as if she were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Agent Miller," Julian said, his eyes still locked on Sarah. "Please remove the trash from my chair." "Richard Calloway," Agent Miller said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs that glinted under the boardroom lights. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit capital murder." 2 agents hauled Calloway up. He didn't fight. He looked at Julian, then at Sarah. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who knows his life is over. As they dragged him out, he didn't say a word. The heavy doors closed behind him. The boardroom remained frozen. The board members stared at Julian, terrified, waiting for the purge. Julian took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in his ribs. He looked at the red folder on the table, then at Sarah. "Simon," Julian said to his godfather, "suspend the merger, initiate a forensic audit of every deal Calloway has touched, and call the press." "What do I tell them?" Simon asked, his voice shaking. Julian limped over to Sarah. He reached out and gently took her bruised, dirty hand in his. "Tell them," Julian said, "that the deal is off, and tell them Sterling Industries is under new management." 3 months later, the autumn rain slicked the streets of Midtown Manhattan, turning the asphalt into a mirror reflecting the neon heartbeat of the city. Outside the revolving doors of Le Bernardin, a black town car idled, but the woman stepping out of it didn't rush. She paused, letting the cool mist touch her face, breathing in the scent of wet concrete and expensive exhaust. Sarah Jenkins adjusted the strap of her clutch. She wasn't wearing the polyester black vest and ill-fitting trousers that had been her armor for half a year. Tonight, she wore an emerald green gown, silk cut on the bias, that draped over her frame like liquid envy. Her hair, once pulled back in a severe, invisible bun, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She walked to the entrance, The last time she had been here, she had used the service entrance near the dumpsters, smelling of dish soap and fear. The maitre d', a man named Henri, who had once snapped his fingers at her for moving too slowly with a bread basket, looked up. His eyes widened, scanning her from the Jimmy Choo heels to the confident set of her jaw. He didn't recognize her. Or perhaps he simply couldn't reconcile the woman standing before him with the ghost who used to clear crumbs from table 4. "Good evening, madam," Henri murmured, bowing lower than usual. "Do you have a reservation?" "I'm joining Mr. Sterling," Sarah said. Her voice was no longer the whisper of a servant. It was the calm, resonant tone of a woman who had testified before a federal grand jury and watched a titan of industry crumble under the weight of her evidence. "Of course. Right this way." Henry led her through the dining room. The hush of the restaurant was the same, the clinking of silver, the murmur of deals being struck. But the energy felt different. Or maybe she was just different. She wasn't watching the floor anymore. She was looking the patrons in the eye. They reached the private dining room. The heavy oak doors were open. Julian Sterling was standing by the window, looking out at the city that he now firmly controlled. He turned as she entered. The change in him was striking. 3 months ago, he had looked like a man walking to the gallows, hollow-cheeked, grey-skinned, vibrating with anxiety. Now, he looked like the cover of Forbes. His shoulders were broad and relaxed in a navy Tom Ford suit. The darkness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a clarity that was almost startling. He didn't just smile when he saw her. His whole face seemed to brighten. "You're late," he said softly, but his tone was teasing. "I had to walk through the front door this time," Sarah replied, stepping into the room. "It takes a little longer when you don't have to sneak past the manager." Julian laughed, a genuine deep sound that warmed the room. He moved to pull out her chair. "You look incredible, Sarah. Green is definitely your color." "Better than service staff black?" "Infinitely." She sat, and he took the seat opposite her. The table was set for 2, but there were no intimidating stacks of legal documents this time. Just crystal, candlelight, and a bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux, breathing in a decanter. "I ordered the wine," Julian said, pouring her a glass. "I figured we owed it a second chance, since the last bottle ended up on Richard Calloway's cuff." Sarah took the glass, watching the ruby liquid swirl. "How is Calloway?" Julian's expression sobered, though he didn't look worried. "The trial starts next month, but the plea deals are already destroying him. His CFO turned state's evidence yesterday. Calloway is looking at 20 years minimum. Sterling Industries has recovered the losses, and the stock is trading at an all-time high. The vultures have scattered." "And you?" Sarah asked, taking a sip. "How are you holding up? It's not easy cleaning up a mess that big." "It's lonely," Julian admitted, looking at her over the rim of his glass. "I spent the last 3 months firing the people who looked the other way. I've rebuilt the compliance department from the ground up. But I have a problem." "Oh?" "I can't find anyone I trust to run the money," Julian said. He reached down and picked up a sleek, black leather portfolio from the floor. He placed it on the table. Sarah's heart did a small flip. "Julian, I told you, I'm happy just being Sarah Jenkins again. I've got my old license back. I can consult. I can—" "Open it," he interrupted gently. Sarah opened the leather folder. Inside, on heavy cream paper, was a contract. She scanned the header, expecting a consulting agreement or perhaps a settlement for her role as a whistleblower. Her breath hitched. Position: Chief Financial Officer. Entity: Sterling Heavy Industries, reporting to Julian A. Sterling, CEO, base salary, $1.5 million plus stock options. She stared at the numbers. It was more money than she had made in her entire life combined. But it wasn't the money that made her hands tremble. It was the title. CFO, she whispered. Julian, this is crazy. I was a waitress 3 months ago. The board will never approve this. The shareholders will think you've lost your mind. The board does what I tell them to do now, Julian said, his voice fierce with conviction. And the shareholders love you. You're the Iron Lady of Audit. The press calls you the woman who saved the company. But that's not why I'm offering it. He leaned forward, his blue eyes locking onto hers. I interviewed 12 candidates for this role, Sarah. Ivy League degrees, 20 years of experience, perfect resumes. And you know what I saw in every single one of them? I saw people who would sign a paper because it was convenient. People who would look away if the numbers got too messy. I don't need a calculator. I can hire 100 accountants. I need a conscience. Sarah looked down at the paper. The memories of the last few years washed over her. The fire in Chicago, the fear of being hunted, the humiliation of invisibility, and then that moment in this very room where she decided to speak up. You need someone who will tell you no, Sarah said. I need someone who will stop me from signing the fatal deal, Julian corrected. I need a partner, Sarah. Not just for the company. For me. I don't trust anyone else. I don't want anyone else. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with something that went beyond professional respect. It was the bond of two people who had stood in a storage unit in Newark, waiting for men with guns to kick down the door, and had chosen to save each other. Sarah looked at the signature line at the bottom of the page. It was blank, waiting. She reached into her purse, but Julian stopped her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. It was the Mont Blanc, the heavy, black resin pen with the gold nib. The same pen he had held over the Ethelgard contract. Use mine, he said softly. Let's rewrite the history of this pen. Sarah took it. The weight of it felt different this time. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a tool. It felt like power. She looked at him, a small, playful smile touching her lips. Just one condition, Mr. Sterling. Julian smiled back, relieved. Name it. You want more vacation? A bigger signing bonus? No, Sarah said. No more mergers with men who wear sunglasses indoors, and no more meetings that start after 8 p.m. on a Friday. Julian laughed, raising his glass. I think I can agree to those terms. Sarah uncapped the pen. The ink flowed smoothly, dark and permanent against the cream paper. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. Sarah Jenkins. She signed her name with a flourish, underlining it twice. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't Miller. She wasn't a victim. She was the CFO of a Fortune 500 company, and she had earned every inch of this seat at the table. She capped the pen and slid the contract back to him. Welcome to the team, Ms. Jenkins, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. Julian reached across the table. He didn't pick up the contract. He took her hand. His grip was warm and solid. He didn't let go, and for the first time, Sarah didn't want to pull away. So, Julian said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Now that we're colleagues, I believe company policy allows for a celebratory dinner. And perhaps, if you're not busy, breakfast tomorrow? Sarah squeezed his hand back. I think I can check my schedule. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and glistening. Inside, the nightmare was finally over. The check had cleared, the bad guys were gone, and for the first time in a long time, the bottom line was simply happiness. Sarah Jenkins went from serving tables to running the boardroom, proving that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody notices. Julian Sterling learned that trust is more valuable than any stock option. What would you have done in Sarah's shoes? Would you have stayed silent to save yourself, or risked it all to speak the truth? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of suspense, betrayal, and justice, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We drop new thrillers every Tuesday and Friday. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.